Where were we the last time we did this character? The vampires? Well, anyway, we're going in a completely different direction this time. A budding village doesn't just flourish without collateral, and lots of it. Sometimes, a bit of philanthropy is handy. Does Alden have any people like that? You bet. Take, for instance, Rory McNamara. Element, Void. Zodiac, Cancer. Blood type, AB. Rory McNamara is the younger sister of Ewan McNamara and the aunt of Tam and his siblings. Rory and Ewan grew up in Kilpatrick with their mother Joan and father Harold. When Ewan decided to leave Kilpatrick for Alden with the promise of having his own bakery, Rory was being courted by a wealthy but mysterious man named Clyde Black. Now, Clyde will be getting his own video later on, so if you want to hear the answers to his side of the story, make sure to like this video, hit the subscribe button, and ring my bell so you'll be notified when it airs. And because of her wit and cunning, Clyde's firstly suave attempts to whisk away Rory's heart were rebuffed repeatedly. As the daughter of a baker, and someone with connections to the guild, she had incentive to be selective about who she decided to marry, and her father was a shrewd businessman that wouldn't let her be wooed by fanciful trips, wealth, and gifts. And just like her mother, Joan, Rory was trained as a bookkeeper. The primary role of this profession is to prepare bank deposits and compiling data for numerous accounts, verifying receipts, and sending various forms of payment to banks, which meant she was literate and good with numbers. Of course, loans, payments, and other forms existed for thousands of years before Common Era, where Assyrian city-states would pay grain loans to citizens that traded goods between cities. During this time, carrying gold between city-states for civilians was actually prohibited. There is actually a pretty compelling story for the development of banks in Europe, and it actually started in 12th century Italy. Investment banks, or merchant banks as they were originally called, were invented by Italian grain merchants during the Middle Ages. These Lombardy merchants and bankers grew in stature based on the strength of the Lombard plains, cereal crops, as well as displaced Jewish folk who were fleeing Spanish persecution at the time. These people brought with them ancient practices of the Middle East and Far East silk routes. Originally intended to finance long trade journeys, they applied these methods to finance grain production and trading. In 1162, Henry II of England began levying a tax to support his crusade against Muslim control of Jerusalem. This actually stimulated the re-emergence of banking in Western Europe, and the Knights Templar as well as Knights Hospitalier acted as Henry's bankers in the Holy Land. It was this sort of push that led to the Europe-wide banking system between 1100 and 1300 CE. So for Rory to have this sort of professional background is actually pretty impressive, but then her family did deal directly with bakery guilds. So it wasn't until Ewan and Rory's father, Harold, passed away that she began to see a softer side of her prospective beau. Having heard of her misfortune, Clyde met with Rory the following night. His usually debonair persona was replaced by something more caring and patient. This appealed to her greatly, and the two of them were able to have one of their first earnest conversations. Rory revealed that she had an appreciation for things that were peculiar, dark. She had a love of England's fog and leavened cakes that, during the time, were decidedly more expensive as leavening agents were rare. I got it right this time. Remember, Rory did bring the cake with her to Alden to share with everybody during Catch and Kiss. It's interesting, something I just thought of, but those with the element of void seem to really like sweets of some kind. Anecdote. Back to this. Clyde in turn revealed he suffered from some loss in his past and wanted to help in any way he could. Now in those times, the loss of her father, her mother aging, and her brother off to a fresh start, a lot of what there was for women to do at the time was just get married. It wasn't as brusque as all that, though. Seeing this more open and earnest side of Clyde helped Rory begin to appreciate him more as a person, and she took their courtship more seriously from then on, until they were married a year later. Rory had come to understand that her husband had a rare disorder. See, she could only visit Clyde at night, and for a while she'd been curious why. Clyde revealed he had a rare condition that meant he would need to stay out of the sun for his entire life. These days we'd likely call this solar urticaria, or sun allergies. And it should be noted that sun allergies can be pretty severe. Sometimes exposure may only take a few seconds and can lead to some pretty painful results for the skin. I don't want to look at pictures of how graphic it might get. If you want to, go for it. But trigger warning on that. In addition to what basically amounts to a third-degree sunburn, some people with this condition may experience headaches, fatigue, nausea, changes in heart rate, and trouble breathing. Even more rare, it can be terminal. So the two of them took it very seriously, and Rory helped him move about in the night, or helped manage his wealth by day. And now see, despite being fairly wealthy, Clyde was just also bad with finances. It became a perfect niche for Rory to slip into, and in exchange for her help, he made sure a portion of his assets were being sent to Alden to help her brother and mother establish themselves up in the Highlands. So that's what Rory meant when she said,
I'd like to talk to you about the next donation.
And so at the start of the video I mentioned philanthropy. Let's talk a little bit about what that all means. Philanthropy is the desire to promote the welfare of others, expressed especially by the donation of money to good causes, according to the Oxford Dictionary. The word philanthropy comes from the ancient Greek and translates to the love of humanity, for philo, love, and anthropos, humankind. During the Middle Ages, philanthropia was replaced in Europe, like many ancient traditions, by the Christian virtue of charity. This is because Christians value the need for salvation, and charity was seen as a way of essentially buying one's way out of purgatory. Thomas Aquinas held that the habit of charity extends not only to the love of God, but also to the love of our neighbor. Interesting how the ancient Greeks and much of the rest of the world held those beliefs in earnest without the constant reminder of some sort of damnation, but I digress. It's not as though ancient Greeks were wholly altruistic, after all. In the 2nd century, Plutarch used the Greek concept of philanthropia to describe human beings that were superior. Basically, if you had more money, you were just a better person overall. Modern understandings of philanthropy began around the 1600s when Sir Francis Bacon, under King James I, funny that name should come up again, he's the James that the King James Version of the Bible is written for. Anyway, Bacon considered philanthropy to be synonymous with goodness and correlated with the Aristotelian concept of virtue as consciously instilled habits of good behavior rather than just a means of salvation. Samuel Johnson is another man who had a lot to say about philanthropy. You guys might recognize him from a certain reaction meme. Yeah, that's the one. Once called the most distinguished man of letters in English history by Oxford, the college he attended to until he basically ran out of money, Johnson was a poet, playwright, essayist, moralist, literary critic, sermonist, biographer, editor, and lexicographer. Wow, I'm inclined to agree with Oxford on this one. Anyway, he defined philanthropy as simply love of humanity or good nature, a definition that has endured into modern day. So, with Rory and her husband both being philanthropists, at least when it came to Alden, I suppose there's a case to be made for other charitable works they may have done at the time. Traveling from Scotland to England, France, Ireland, and Britain, the pair would fund starving artists, budding villages that promoted avant-garde lifestyle of inclusivity and equity, as well as, of course, bakers and patissiers, a type of French, Italian, and Belgian bakery that specializes in pastries or sweets. In some countries, it is a legally controlled title that may only be used by bakeries that employ a licensed maître pâtissier, and that's French for master pastry chef. And I probably pronounced it horribly. Like with blacksmiths and other kinds of middle-aged professions that required a certain mastery, pâtissiers require a lengthy training process, which is typically acquired through apprenticeship and a written examination. It's through sharing these special treats with the youth of Alden that Rory hopes to expand their knowledge of the world outside of the village and help mold Alden into the medieval age marvel that Matthias and her brother had always hoped it would become. And of the youth, there is one that would catch Rory's attention for his interest in baking. I'll save that reveal for a little later on, but here's a hint. It isn't Tam McNamara. And now what about the area where she lives? Unlike the rest of her family, Rory's primary home is in Kilpatrick. Stationed next to Clydesbank, which is named for its station on the River Clyde, Old Kilpatrick is a village in West Dumbartonshire. Back in Rory's time, the population was only around 300, but today it sports about a few thousand. The town is named thus because it belonged to the parish of Old Kilpatrick, and the name comes from Scottish Gaelic literally meaning Patrick's Church. Now, the Forth and Clyde Canal actually separates this village from the north bank of the River Clyde, and the immediate western neighbor is the town of Bowling. North of Kilpatrick are the Kilpatrick Hills, a range of hills stretching from Dumbartonshire to Strathblane, and the place where Alden is set. Old Kilpatrick sits at the westernmost end of Antonine Wall, built in 142 CE by order of Roman Emperor Antonius Pius. The wall took about 12 years to complete and was meant to supersede Hadrian's Wall to the south. 16 forts were built along the stone fortification after pressure from the Caledonians, the Iron Age Celtic people, pushed Antonius and his troops further north. Soldiers who built the wall commemorated the construction, as well as their conflict with the Caledonians, by means of decorative slabs, only 20 of which survive. However, the wall was left abandoned only 8 years after its completion, with most of the garrisons relocating to Hadrian's. Most of the wall's fortifications have been destroyed over time, but some remain visible and have come under the protection of Historic Environment Scotland and UNESCO World Heritage Committee, two philanthropic organizations committed to preserving ancient Scottish heritage. Rory dresses fairly lavishly, just like Edna, in all black clothing, but her embroidery makes her dress even more fanciful. Originally, I was going to give her painted nails, and it was possible back in her day. Actually, nail coloring existed as far back as the times of Cleopatra, with well over 5,000 years of history, spanning back to ancient China. Originally, nail polish was made with beeswax, gelatin, and egg white dyed with orchids or roses. This would be spread over the nails and left to dry for a number of hours, leaving a stain. Red and black were actually the most popular colors back then, but were only reserved for wealthy and powerful. Actually, it was considered a crime in China to wear nail polish unless you were just so well off. And while the Chinese methods of coloring nails stretched across India, Africa, and the Middle East, where Egyptians started coloring their nails with henna, and Cleopatra's favorite was a deep blood red. But these techniques wouldn't make it to Europe where Rory lived until the 1700s, where it was still associated with the fabulously wealthy until the first nail salon opened in Paris, France in the 1800s. Rory becomes an important and ever-present part of Martin's life spanning well into his adulthood. Ultimately, it's not as though her contributions to Alden aren't fruitful in many ways, but there's just too much to say without spoiling some major parts of the plot that we'd like you to discover in the future installments of our web series, and through these projects. Visually, she's based on a young Helen Hunt with a dark Gothic flair. Which is fair enough to say, actually, but I don't necessarily mean that in just the way she dresses in black. Gothic in this sense refers to a period of medieval Europe between the late 800s when the last Carolingian king died, remember Charlemagne, and the 1500s when gunpowder was invented. For reference, take a look at this style of Marie d'Anjou, Queen of France, in the 1400s, and then compare it to Rory's dress. The Goths were a Germanic people that played a major role in overthrowing the Roman Empire and the emergence of medieval Europe. For this reason, Goth has always been associated with going against the contemporary and the subversion of societal norms. In ancient sources, Goths are always described as tall and athletic, with light skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes. A 4th century Greek historian described their characteristics in a pejorative way, saying that the Goth provoked contempt, that they were too big for their feet, and had pinched waists like insects. Ugh. Procopius, on the other hand, notes that the Vandals and Gepids looked similar to Goths, and they were tall and handsome to look upon. And it seems to me they're describing Matthias, or his sons, and perhaps it's the reason why Rory thinks of the twins so fondly. One of the most notable associations with Goths, aside from their conquest of Rome, were black clothes and bats, is the architectural spires that began adorning many buildings during this time. In Gothic architecture, spires represented the heavenly aspirations of the pious medieval man. There's probably a lot more I could say about that, but I don't want to babble on about too long. Spires originated in the 12th century, right before Rory's time, as a simple four-sided pyramidal roof, generally abrupt and stunted, capping a church tower. The history is a development towards slimmer, higher forms, and a more organic relationship with the tower below. So is it fair to say that Rory is Gothic or a Goth? Maybe. Though it wouldn't be in the contemporary sense. Contemporary Goth is a musical subculture that began in the UK around the 1980s. It is, however, inspired by this period as mostly a counterculture movement. A good example of the bridge between medieval Goth and contemporary Goth is possibly the author Oscar Wilde, who's well known for his controversial stories that criticized ruling powers, the king and the church, and had a strong focus on sexuality, gender, and the macabre. He also was a large inspiration for the writing style of Angel Moreland, one of the Tales of Atonement's two authors. We did say she had a fondness for London fog, so while imagining her in this cobblestone street, we're also putting down some foggy clouds, just enough to cover up some things without completely obscuring the finished picture. And there we go. Oh, this one actually took a lot, but I'm really pleased with the results. Ultimately, it's all there is to say about Rory for now. Like, subscribe, and ring my bell to get notified of new videos each time they air. We are always hard at work to find things you guys be interested in, so if you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. We'd also like for you to take a look at the Tales of Atonement Patreon. There's all kinds of things, including bonus content that you can access, and some have already taken advantage of those benefits, such as Shadow Fox, Arya Gamari, Charles Tam, Jace Moreland, and Lunder Lumen. Art for this week, along with every Bingo Book project, is provided by Shalak on Fiverr. Look for the link down in the description as well. I'll see you back again for the next great project and more folkloric discussions Thursday at 3 p.m. Pacific. Until then, thank you for coming.